You're listening to a Roddenberry podcast.
Don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. We'll have more news this evening, but first...
The latest Gene-ology, a Roddenberry podcast.
Episode 57, 333 Montgomery. Welcome to Mission Log Gene-ology. I'm Earl Green.
And I'm Ashley Thomas.
Each week on Gene-ology, we examine a show or a script from Gene Roddenberry's early TV writing career, putting it on trial to see if it's complicit in delivering the kinds of morals, meanings, and messages that were often in evidence in Gene's most famous later creation, Star Trek.
Exhibit A this week, the pilot episode for a Gene Roddenberry legal drama starring a very familiar face, beloved to Star Trek fans the world over, in an early starring role.
Testify.
Earl will be back with trivia in a moment, but first, here is how you can reach us. Gene-ology is meant to be entertaining and informative, but it's also just the beginning of an ongoing conversation about the works of Gene Roddenberry. Please drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com and join us on Facebook at missionlogpod. Now, while you're at it, leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. Those 5-star reviews are really what help folks find the show, so please leave us one of those. And please remember, your comments could be used on future installments of Gene-ology. And now, the trivia. The whole trivia and nothing but the trivia. So help you God, Earl.
Oh, help me. All right, we are graduating through various flavors of pilots on Gene-ology. We've read scripts for pilots that didn't get filmed, and now we are graduating to pilots that did get filmed, but didn't sell a series. Someday we'll get to a pilot that did sell its series, and before it's all over with, believe it or not, we will talk about pilots that did sell their series, and yet the series still managed to not happen. It's never a dull moment chronicling Gene's career. To oversimplify things just a little bit, it's the ambition of just about every TV writer to create their own project. Now, there are TV writers who never quite achieve that, but very few are the TV writers who don't set their sights on eventually creating their own show. The first time Gene was tasked with trying to create a show of his own was during the years he spent employed primarily by Ziv Television, where he was paired with another bright up-and-coming talent, one Quinn Martin, to create the format of a show tentatively titled Junior Executive. Though Gene and Quinn spent some time developing the idea, it never went anywhere, but we'll spot some Junior Executive DNA in an upcoming Gene project, The Lieutenant. Also during the Ziv years, Gene pitched a series called Hawaiian Passage to CBS, which never got made. Think of it as The Love Boat with more drama than comedy, decades before The Love Boat premiered. There was also another Unsold pilot, The Man from Lloyd's, about a dashing, adventurous insurance adjuster working for Lloyd's of London, a character Gene named Anthony Riker, Riker with a Y. Two major turning points for Gene happened fairly early. He watched an episode of Highway Patrol air that wasn't anything like what he had written, a very rude awakening that told him he did not have creative control. Conventional Hollywood wisdom of the time was that the solution to that problem was to become a producer. More responsibility, but also more control. And in 1957, having completed a stint as a staff writer on West Point, he landed a development deal with Screen Gems to create new shows, or at least to generate new ideas for shows until he landed on one that they felt like investing the money to produce a pilot. We've already spent some quality time with his first Screen Gems pitch, The Man from Texas, for which Gene wrote two very different pilot scripts about Sam Houston. The Screen Gems deal also allowed Gene to breathe a little. He was a creator under contract, and that meant there was consistent, steady pay involved, which is a bit of an outlier for television writers. During this time, he also entertained other offers, including being courted by Lou Grade of ITC Productions in the UK, later famous for producing such shows as The Saint, Danger Man, The Prisoner, Thunderbirds, Space 1999, and The Muppet Show. Though Gene did do some work on a show for ITC Productions, which we'll be getting to fairly soon, he eventually turned down the opportunity to leave the U.S. to live and work in England. Now, you talk about something that would have completely changed the timeline. But Even being headhunted from across the Atlantic paid off because Gene used this bit of news to get Screen Gems to sweeten the pot and keep him under contract. According to his authorized biography, Gene was raking in about $100,000 a year under the Screen Gems contract. In 1959, a pilot Gene wrote for a police drama called Nightstick, early working title Footbeat, was filmed at Screen Gems, and it did sell. It was promised a slot on ABC's Sunday night schedule, until a change of thinking in the executive suite saw ABC deciding to program nothing but westerns on Sunday nights. Though it was the first Gene Roddenberry pilot to be produced, Nightstick is now completely lost media. We don't have film, we don't have the script. All we know is that the script was titled The Big Walk. That brings us to the first Gene Roddenberry pilot that we can actually see, and that's 333 Montgomery, also filmed at Screen Gems, starring one DeForest Kelley, whose first work on a Gene script had happened in an episode of Boots and Saddles, The Marquis of Donnybrook, which we covered in episode 51 of this very podcast. Based on the book Never Plead Guilty, a memoir by celebrity attorney Jacob W. Ehrlich, 333 Montgomery was expected to be the opening act of an entire series of legal and investigative exploits of slightly fictionalized attorney Jake Britten. A series Bible written by Gene and dated October 22, 1959, describes Jake Britten as follows. Like San Francisco, Jake Britten is first characterized by striking individuality. He is not a type, follows no fashion but his own, whether in dress, opinion, politics, or morals. As in the case of his city, he is also filled with startling contrasts. Immense love, deep hates, courtly manners which passed on a century ago, and yet of philosophies too advanced for most of his contemporaries. He can be greedy, even ruthless, in wringing fantastic fees from his clients. At the same time, his generosities in areas of misfortune are legendary. He is capable of handling himself in the rough and tumble of a dark alley. He is one of the country's outstanding experts on the historical relationship of law and the Holy Bible. He moves among the wealthy with more aplomb than a tax collector, and among thieves and prostitutes with the ease of a gangland figure. Now, this almost sounds like paladin attorney at law, doesn't it?
Sure does.
The character may not be a type, but when it comes to characters, it sounds like Gene definitely has a type. Gene went on to write of the series concept, "This is not a crime, detection, mystery, or court trial series. Although our stories will involve all these areas, our focus is on the man. The subject of each story will be utilized primarily as a vehicle which takes us into our real story, the character and excitement of Jake Britten." A paragraph or so later, he concludes, "We have no desire to directly compete with existing television series, nor are we interested in television's usual pallid, safely middle-of-the-road, curly-haired hero stereotype watered down to appease and appeal to every segment of society. Jake Britten is unique, as individual as a human fingerprint. Only an accurate rendition of this exciting, resourceful man will give us the fresh new series we want. We intend to bring it to television that way." Say what you like about Gene, he gave really good pitch document. We may quote some more from the series Bible and script later, but now let's talk about the cast. Of course, we have DeForest Kelley as Jake Britten. So much has been said about DeForest Kelley already, and I feel like it's safe to assume that if you're tuning in every week for a podcast about the works of Gene Roddenberry, you know a lot of those biographical broad strokes already. D. Kelley's first exposure to Gene's writing came in the Marquis of Donnybrook episode of Boots and Saddles, which we covered in podcast number 51. And of course, following their close collaboration on 333 Montgomery, they became good friends, and Gene kept DeForest in mind for much of his later work, including Star Trek and another pilot Gene would write with DeForest Kelley in mind, Police Story, which was produced at Desilu in 1967, but pitched unsuccessfully to NBC. As Eve Fremont, we have Joanna Barnes, though she has some big-name movies in her CV, including Spartacus, Auntie Mame, and both the 1961 and 98 versions of The Parent Trap. Joanna Barnes was a frequent flyer on TV, starting in the heyday of the Playhouse series and then racking up guest appearances on the likes of Maverick, The Jim Backus Show, The Beverly Hillbillies, Hawaii Five-0, the Planet of the Apes TV series, the live-action one that is, Barney Miller, Benson, even Cheers. She co-starred with Peter Falk in the short-lived 1965 sitcom The Trials of O'Brien. Her acting appearances tail off at the turn of the century, but that's not all she was doing. She also wrote a popular syndicated newspaper column and several novels. We lost Joanna in 2022. Stephen Peck guest stars as Frank Piper. 333 Montgomery is an early entry in Stephen's list of TV and film roles, but despite appearing in Alfred Hitchcock Presents, I Spy, The Flying Nun, Hill Street Blues, and The Powers of Matthew Starr, acting was not Stephen's only gig. He owned a dance studio or two, which operated for decades, and he was a professional choreographer. And if that's not enough, Stephen was also a restaurateur, co-founder of Angelo's and Vinci's Ristorante in Fullerton, California, which was named Orange County's best pizza in 2004. We lost the multi-talented Stephen Peck in 2005. Richard Shannon gets a very small role here as the prosecuting attorney. Now, we've seen Richard Shannon before, and so has Gene. As we mentioned back in episode 48 of this podcast, Richard starred in the now lost-to-time pilot for Gene's proposed police drama Nightstick, and Richard would portray a character in a later Gene script for Have Gun Will Travel, where he guest starred as Eli Morgan in the 1962 episode Alice, which we already covered. 333 Montgomery was also an early career entry for director Paul Wenkos. As only the most reliable and budget-conscious directors do, Paul quickly piled on an amazing number of credits in 50s and 60s TV, including a dozen episodes each of The Detectives and The Untouchables, and numerous episodes of I Spy, The Invaders, and Dr. Kildare, the latter of which saw him directing another of Gene's scripts, the 1962 episode A Distant Thunder. Paul moved into feature films and occasional TV movies in the 1970s, helming such movies as The Guns of the Magnificent Seven, The Mephisto Waltz, and The Bad Seed, while still taking on occasional episodic TV assignments along the way. We lost Paul in 2009. Despite the talented cast and everyone's best efforts, 333 Montgomery joined the ranks of countless other pilots that didn't convince any networks to hand out a series order. But because studios don't like to watch money go down the drain, the pilot earned a slot as an episode of Alcoa Goodyear Theater. Since all of them were anthologies without continuing characters, the various Playhouse series frequently gave a home to unloved, unsold pilots, giving the studios that produced them a chance to recoup at least some of the costs. 333 Montgomery aired, depending on which source you go by, either 1 day or 1 month after the end of the 1960 writers' strike. The date on my spreadsheet is June 13th, 1960, which is just a day after the Guild approved its new agreement. It aired during Alcoa Goodyear Theater's third season. But if you're thinking that 1960 broadcast was the last anyone ever heard of this show, think again. 333 Montgomery was seen at least as recently as a rerun in the late 80s in an A&E series called The Golden Age of Television, which repackaged a number of black and white shows, also frequently trimmed as many as 4 minutes from each one so they could sell more ads. When you're talking about a show from 1960, that's probably a 25 or 26-minute running time, so nearly 1/6 of the show would be missing from these cable reruns. I've also seen some breadcrumbs indicating that Turner Classic Movies may also have repeated 333 Montgomery. Whether that is in uncut form or in this cut-down cable form, I have no idea. But where those 4 minutes are concerned, we lucked out because the Roddenberry archive holds Gene's revised final draft script, dated February 4th, 1960, though not everything in that script matches the final film. Put a pin in that. We'll get there. The good news for you listening is that this episode, apparently from one of these A&E repeats in the 80s, is preserved on YouTube, so you can go look 333 Montgomery up and watch it. 333 Montgomery may not have sold a series, but it was a fitting way to celebrate the end of the strike. And in just under 2 months after this, Gene's first series to reach the airwaves, with more than just a pilot episode, would premiere. The story of Jacob Ehrlich did eventually inspire a TV series lasting a single season. That show was called Sam Benedict, which ran from fall 1962 into the spring of 1963, starring Edmund O'Brien. MGM was responsible for that take on Ehrlich's legal exploits, which this time were given a full hour to play out, and that series was created and produced by Gene's good friend E. Jack Newman, who we talked about before in the days of West Point.
If the court permits, let me risk stating the greatest respect and admiration for the witness's professional ability and integrity. Frankly, I'm a little confused, Captain. Your complete testimony has concerned the number of shots fired into the victim's body. What about the bullet holes in the room?
You're referring to Piper's statement that he fired a warning shot? Well, upon taking that statement, I personally went over the Fremont home inch by inch. There's absolutely no evidence that such a shot was ever fired.
As the court knows, a defense lawyer's case is predicated upon the veracity of his client. I've already expressed my high opinion of Captain Quincy's integrity, which can only mean that my client is lying. So now I ask for a reasonable continuance while I consider whether or not to ask to be relieved as defense counsel.
Prologue. Jake Britten narrates the action as a well-dressed man named Frank Piper steps out of a cab and walks up the steps to a swanky San Francisco home where Eve Fremont, an equally well-dressed woman, is waiting. Moments later, there's a scream, shots ring out, and Piper tumbles back out of the apartment with a gun in his hand, grappling with another man. Meet Charles Fremont, Eve's husband. Piper disentangles himself from Mr. Fremont and races away from the scene, still armed. Charles Fremont tumbles down the stairs and hits the ground, dead. Act 1. Attorney Jake Britten sits in the office of Police Captain Quincy, looking through a police file as Quincy tells him the Piper murder case will be open and shut. Jake mentions that he hasn't represented a client on death row before, and he takes Quincy to task for editorializing the details. But Quincy can't help it. Piper's had a long history of stalking Eve Fremont, sending lewd letters and other harassing, going-on dangerous behavior. The department has been waiting a long time to hit Piper with charges that stick. In Quincy's words, Piper is a dirty little animal. But Quincy also can't stop himself from saying that Eve is a whole different social class than Piper, and that seems to offend his sensibilities on some level. With that, Jake leaves the captain's office. It's time to get his client's side of the story. Jake visits Frank Piper in prison. Piper acknowledges that there was just a little bit of a mismatch of which social circles he and Eve moved in, but he surprises Jake by saying that it was Eve who first initiated the relationship with him. Sometime later, she's suggested a rendezvous. Piper was to arrive at her home at a certain time, and if he saw Eve at the balcony window, then it was safe to come in. If she didn't show up, that was the signal that her husband was still at home. Piper says it was all a setup. He does admit that he was armed and that after firing one shot into the floor during the struggle with Eve's husband, he got scared and fired 3 shots into the man's chest. Jake grills Piper on the details again. This story doesn't change. And that's the moment when Jake surprises Piper. I'll take the case. Murder is committed with malice aforethought. At worst, Piper should be up on manslaughter charges for defending himself with deadly force. Piper's worried that even Jake's best efforts won't keep him from being executed. And even Jake seems worried that the entire case rests on finding evidence of the one stray bullet that didn't hit Eve's husband. Now let's go over the details again. And cut to the actual trial, as Eve Fremont tells her side of the story of meeting Frank Piper. It's very different from what we just heard from Piper, the story of her turning away unwanted advances from a guy who just didn't seem inclined to take no for an answer. She testifies that Piper was a creep and a stalker. We cut to later in her testimony as she recounts the death of her husband, but she says there were only 3 shots fired. Aha! Jake reminds her that her statement to the police mentioned 4 shots. And he really presses home that point. She said 2 very different things. On the stand, Eve insists it was 3, and the prosecuting attorney objects to Jake badgering the witness, offering expert testimony backing up Eve's story. That expert witness is Captain Quincy of the SFPD. Quincy is very firm that 3 shots struck Eve's husband. But, Jake asks, what about evidence of a 4th shot that went wild, hitting something else in the room? Captain Quincy says there's no evidence of a 4th shot anywhere at the crime scene. Jake admits out loud to the entire courtroom that he has the utmost respect for Quincy and his department, and that his client might be lying. Shocked, Frank Piper stands up, and Jake continues, asking for a continuance of the trial so he can weigh whether or not he will continue representing the accused. Act 2. Jake is back in his office expecting a phone call from Captain Quincy. Jake's secretary, Liz, hits him with the big question. You are dropping Piper's case, aren't you? But Jake admonishes her in a friendly way. A good legal secretary should believe nothing that she sees, and even less of what she hears. Jake says Piper is obviously guilty of manslaughter, but he is still not convinced Piper is guilty of murder. And that could be the difference between a lengthy stay behind bars or the death sentence that Piper's facing. Furthermore, Jake's been digging up dirt on Eve Fremont, and there's apparently plenty of dirt to dig through. She has a colorful history being banned from bars and private clubs for misbehavior. Jake believes Eve, tired of dealing with a clingy lover like Frank Piper, set him up to be killed by her own husband, after which they both would have testified that Piper attacked them, and of course, Piper wouldn't have been around to defend himself. But that's not how it played out. That's when the phone rings. Captain Quincy, as expected. Jake does his best to charm his old friend into letting Jake examine the crime scene, but the police captain hangs up on him. Not the desired result. As Jake tries to figure out what his next move is, Liz, who is a good legal secretary, by the way, is way ahead of her boss. She knows which police officers are on duty at the crime scene and when. And she knows the officer currently on duty owes Jake a favor. When Jake arrives at the Fremont residence currently patrolled by a young policeman named Collins, he and Jake are longtime acquaintances, and he rather weakly protests that he's under order from the captain to keep the place sealed off. Jake plays the old friend card expertly. Collins knows better than to think that Jake will destroy or tamper with any evidence that may be there. Once Collins helps him establish roughly where each man would have been standing at the time shots were fired, Jake gets down on his knees and starts looking over the entire square footage of the entryway floor for signs of that 4th shot. It takes him hours. Collins returns and tells him he's about to go off shift. If another officer catches Jake here, there will be plenty of trouble to go around for everyone. But Jake's not done. He gets the frustrated Collins to help him reenact the attack so Jake can get a better idea of where the bullet might have hit. And finally, he finds it lodged into the wall behind a loose baseboard. Would have been very easy not to notice it. Another officer is here to relieve Collins, and Collins hustles Jake out the back door. Jake's next stop, Captain Quincy's office, where he levels a very serious accusation at his old friend. Jake says Quincy has hidden evidence, and the captain takes great umbrage to this statement, kindly offering to punch Jake on the spot. But unaware that Jake's already been there, Quincy instead says, hey, we will go to the crime scene together right now, and you are going to help me go over every inch of the place. Once they're back at the Fremont place, Jake plays dumb, but gently brings Quincy's attention back around to the loose baseboard. The captain gets to discover the missing evidence for himself and pats himself on the back. Oh, you're lucky I sealed this scene up and put a deputy outside. If you'd wandered in here and found this slug yourself, that jury would never believe in 1,000 years that you hadn't planted it. Jake just smiles and says, say, I never thought of that. Back in the courtroom the next day, Jake has brought the discovery of the 4th bullet to the forefront of the proceedings, as well as the fact that prior to the killing of her husband, Eve Fremont apparently never reported any of Frank Piper's unwanted advances to the police. And Jake seizes on the prosecution's case that a woman of Eve's social station would never have anything to do with a Frank Piper. If the world was perfectly ordered and people stayed in their social lane, something like this would never happen. But, Jake argues, the world doesn't work that way. Jake also points out that an awful lot of coincidences had to happen to hide that 4th bullet. He tries to plant the reasonable doubt in the minds of the jury that maybe Frank Piper is telling the truth, and Eve Fremont isn't. So, who really initiated the chain of events that ended in the death of Charles Fremont. Act 3. The jury has had time to deliberate on the new evidence brought forth and on Jake Britton's claim that Frank Piper was maneuvered into a position where he would have to either kill or die. Piper is found guilty, but only of manslaughter, not murder. He's looking at anywhere from a year to a decade behind bars. Jake is congratulated by the prosecuting attorney now that their part of due process is over, and they agree to have lunch the next day. Jake leaves the court until his next case. The end.
All right, Earl, I believe your recap has been found guilty of being awesome.
I rest my case, thank you.
No, great job on the recap, my friend. This is an interesting one to look at.
It's one in a series of one. We have no idea where this would have gone from here, especially with all of this flowery language in Gene's series pitch, saying, oh, this is not going to be a courtroom trial series. It's like, okay, well, I mean, we did get some evidence gathering and some field work here. I'm just wondering how broadly he envisioned this show. And, of course, we'll never know.
Yeah, all good questions. What could it have been? I gotta say, I like the vibe of this show. I feel like this is one I would have enjoyed watching, even though I don't really watch a lot of procedurals.
Very brightly lit noir.
Yeah, it was definitely some brightly lit noir. That's a really good way to put it. Okay. Dig the music for this. As a sax player, really dig the music. How about you?
Okay, now, I noticed that, and it kind of gave me a chuckle, because the sax just kicks in anytime Piper's reminiscing about the first time he met Eve Fremont. Yeah, and it's, and it's like sexy sax. It's just such a trope. It's a noir stereotype. And every time we go over those details of him meeting Eve, man, here comes a sax solo, paging Kenny G.
Well, and to be fair, would it have been a trope at this time, or is it still in establishing the trope mode?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
That's, we're very early on. However, I feel like it was probably already established in cinema.
Yeah.
And the TV was probably just picking it up.
Oh, it's just some musical shorthand, I guess, to, kind of get the audience to know how they should be thinking and feeling about the situation.
Yeah, I know I said it was brightly lit noir, and that's because at the time, in these formative days of TV, there was a perception that you had to kind of overlight everything for it to be visible. Now, that was starting to change, so I noticed that there are scenes like when Jake is first kind of questioning Piper. Okay, so we're attenuating the light coming into the room with Venetian blinds or something, or the shadow of Venetian blinds. But there's still a lot of light. And so that's why I called it brightly lit noir, because we're trying to play into the conventions of noir, but we can't drop the lighting because from a technical standpoint, we don't know how to do that yet. I know this story takes place in San Francisco and not Las Vegas, but bear with me here for just a second. If you're Charles Fremont, you've just been gunned down and you end up lying dead in the road, is that the worst kind of Fremont Street experience or what?
I think that might qualify.
No zip lines, no light shows, no dollar daiquiris.
Earl, I don't know if you noticed this. Did you happen to see that DeForest works in the Hall of Justice?
Yes, meanwhile, in the Hall of Justice.
Meanwhile, at the Hall of Justice. As soon as I saw that, I was like, I really hope Earl notices that so we can both say, meanwhile, at the Hall of Justice.
Well, the Super Friends can't be on duty all the time. And so,
Yep.
And they've got to pay for that place somehow. So I'm sure they lease out some office space to people who they feel like are also crusaders for justice.
Yep. Little attorney Jake. He can rent out some office space from the Super Friends, right?
Exactly. I feel like he is definitely worthy.
Oh my
There's
God.
something else in the scene where Piper is being questioned by Jake for the first time. So we're back in the Venetian blinds room. he describes being approached in a very unfriendly way by Mr. Fremont. And he said the phrase, "He's big, and I'm all shook up." And and I just immediately, just got Elvis in the brain. And if you didn't also get Elvis in the brain when you heard "I'm all shook up," you're younger than 30.
Well, I don't know. The kids these days have had the opportunity to see 2 modern Elvis movies in the past 5 years.
Well, that's true.
So,
That's true. So
yeah, so maybe they would understand the reference. So.
we will all be all shook up forever.
Forever. So Earl, I see from our collective notes that you've got some good ideas about the differences between like scripts versus what was filmed, etc.
And remember that I said earlier that this show got cut down even further than its already short form. You could really tell where we lost our 4 minutes of show because the show itself was edited on film, and so you generally had dissolves or cuts. But then occasionally you wind up with this very obvious electronic wipe. And it's usually a diagonal across the screen, and it's like, okay, now you guys did that with a TV switcher in 1985 or something, and that was not where the original show was cut. However, we also have the script, so we kind of know what did get cut. In that fade from Jake's office where he's talking with Liz to where he enters the Fremont home to do some investigating, what we lost was a bit of a captain's log. It's more of that noir-style narration from Jake Britten, so DeForest Kelley would have been reading this, and it goes as follows. Out the east window, I can see the San Francisco Bay Bridge, at this distance as fragilely graceful as it is beautiful. And from the north window, Alcatraz, squat, ugly, the alpha and omega of man's possibilities. The first has beauty, strength, usefulness. The second represents electrically wired chairs, trap doors for dropping bodies to the end of a taut rope, little green rooms where cyanide pellets drop into an acid bath. You know which one I believe in, Liz. If you ever see me weaken, hand me that memo. So all of that plays out as Jake is putting his jacket back on, putting his hat back on, getting ready to leave his office. That may be my favorite piece of writing in this whole thing, and depending on whether we're watching the original or an edited-down version for cable repeats, didn't get to hear it.
It's a shame. That's good stuff there. I think there's other really good lines in here, but we'll get to that in a moment.
Yeah.
But go ahead.
Yeah, so if Gene thought being the producer was going to mean he had the final say, well, I've got bad news for him. Also in the cable repeat, you missed the scene where Collins has to shoo Jake out the back door of the Fremont house, as well as another scene where Jake and Captain Quincy begin their search of the crime scene. Those are fairly minor cuts, but they're obvious because, again, that wipe effect is far too modern to have been part of the original film edit. There is a huge difference between the final scene that we get in the show and the final scene in Gene's supposedly final revised draft of the script. And this time, this is not the fault of someone editing the show decades later. Something got changed between writing and filming. As originally written, rather than shaking Frank Piper's hand and wishing him well, Jake's response to Piper is kind of icy. He refuses to shake hands, and instead he wipes the sweat off of his brow and walks away without another word. And then there's a curious exchange between Jake and the prosecuting attorney right after they set their lunch date, which I am guessing this never got filmed. The stage direction tells us that Eve Fremont gets up suddenly with the scrape of her chair, wheels, and angrily exits. Both men turn and watch her go. Jake says, sympathetically, Piper'll get 1 to 10. She'll wish she could trade with him. The prosecutor says, almost sounds like you're sorry for her. Jake nods as he watches Eve exit off stage and says, defense is my business, Phil. I hate to see things destroyed. I really kind of like that. I wonder why that got omitted. Because I would remind everyone that just last week we were watching an episode of Hotel de Paris that hung nicknames like Black Widow and Jezebel on Sabrina. And Sabrina didn't get to say a single word in her own defense.
Mhm.
And it feels to me like we're getting that treatment again with Eve Fremont. I'll have a lot more to say on this in discussion, but I just kind of wanted to flag that rather major scene change because I feel like we got robbed there.
Yeah.
Now, one last note from a production standpoint. This is really just more of a curiosity. Just file this one under the times they are a-changin'. Page 3 of Gene's final revised script, so really before the story begins, this is a note to all involved with the production. It reads as follows. Please make certain during the shooting of this picture that the following don'ts are observed in regard to actions and pieces of business. Number 1, no smoking or use or display of any type of tobacco products. Number 2, no use of matches or mechanical lighters. Number 3, no use of beer or alcoholic beverages of any kind. Number 4, no drunkenness. Number 5, no shaving or display of shaving equipment. Number 6, no derogatory treatment of food or drug products, household appliances, or automobiles. Number 7, when such props are required, no use of identifiable brand features of any food, drug, or appliance products, either in labels or in peculiarity or uniqueness of shape or design. Now, as tempting as it is to think this might be the tip of an iceberg of a societal shift towards seeing smoking or drinking to excess as being harmful, what it really boils down to is, let's not make any potential sponsors mad at us. Because you notice they're saying, okay, don't show any specific lighter because we don't want to give Bic a reason not to advertise lighters in our show. Don't mention any specific beer because we don't want to scare off Anheuser-Busch. So, it really boils down to who wants to use the same brand of anything as an accused killer or as the same brand as a wealthy socialite who sets up her side dish to be an accused killer. And please, won't someone please think of the shaving equipment?
Same reason no car, train, or airline wanted to be included in planes, trains, and automobiles.
Very good example. Very good example.
Yeah.
Because
nobody wants that kind of reputation.
Yeah, there's product placement, and then there's also, holy cow, we want nothing to do with that.
We would what's the opposite of product placement?
Yeah, product removal.
Product removal.
Yeah, so they just, I guess they wanted to keep the option open that maybe, just maybe, the sales department could pull off, and if necessary, we'll rename the show, Gillette sponsoring A Shave with Justice.
I approve. The blade of justice fell swiftly upon Piper.
Oh, no. Yeah, I see. They don't want, that's the product placement they don't want.
Nope.
Okay, Ashley, this is quite a gear shift from last week, which was happy-go-lucky, bordering on comedy western. And now it's matters of life and death. What did you find here that it perhaps leads to a more serious discussion? I may have already tipped my hand in that area.
For her to have her name in the title, 333 Montgomery, featuring Joanna Barnes, she's got one scene.
Yeah.
Really, with one scene with dialogue. You have the opening of the episode where she's in the window and she's making eyes at Piper, and she's all like, "Oh, hello, Piper, you are looking so makey-outy tonight. Why don't you come upstairs? I'm going to give you my signal because nobody's home." Hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And then, that was not the case. But she's doing all that with her eyes. So, no spoken dialogue there. I mean, and that's not shade on what she's doing. I thought the acting that she did in that opening was very good.
Yeah. Now, she did already have a bit of a pedigree as a film star. So I think her placement in the credits had a lot to do with, hey, here's a name you know.
Okay. Well, that's fair then. But still, she's got one scene with dialogue, and that's in the courtroom, and it's not very long. Almost all of the dialogue in this episode goes to DeForest Kelley, which I ain't mad about DeForest having lines. He's great. The guy playing Piper, also good. I find that frustrating, just because, if she's in the title card, why isn't she given more opportunity to, act, or be more of a player? I think Jake's secretary had more lines than her, or at least an equal amount, and, you don't get her name until the, the end credits. It felt disproportionate to me on that front. My biggest problem with this episode, and let me caveat, women can do bad things. And this particular show shows us a woman doing a bad thing. But the framework in which we are given this example of a woman doing a bad thing would never fly today. Like, we would never see an episode written with this story because it's too close to women who are actual victims of sexual harassment and then being put under the spotlight when they report it, and then suffering, even if, yes, it's found to be true, they suffer ill social consequences afterwards. Mr. Nerdy Blogger and I have been rewatching Brooklyn Nine-Nine. There's a really great episode about this very thing in, I believe, the 6th season, where you have a woman who reports harassment or an assault. There's an investigation, but she's offered like an NDA or whatever. But anyway, the moral of the story is, even though the man's found to be guilty, she's still forced to quit her job because she's lost all the social credibility because it's a boys' club over there. Yeah. And none of the men will interact with her anymore, which means she doesn't get advancement. She doesn't get leads at her job like she should. That's the end of it. And so, all of that being said, bringing that back to 333 Montgomery, you've got a story where this woman is presented as, may or may not be true. And then all this evidence is brought up as like, oh, well, she was dismissed from this club because she was having inappropriate behavior or whatever, and blah, blah, blah. And so it's a mixed bag for me watching this episode. I like the structure. I thought that was interesting. I like DeForest Kelley. He's great. But I found it frustrating that, again, she's not really... The irony of her one scene with lines is she's on the stand and trying to speak in her own defense. And DeForest character Jake makes a point of even saying later in the episode, she's not the one on trial here. And yet, she is.
Uh-huh. This element of the script also bugged me. And one of the thoughts I had is that some of this could have been solved if this was an hour-long show.
Yes.
Because, and again, this is a weird symptom of us going through Gene's scripts more or less in somewhat vaguely chronological order. And we're going through just Gene stuff. So we're picking up trends that probably no one else has ever noticed before. But for the second show in a row, just like Sabrina last week on the much less serious Hotel de Paris, everything we find out about Eve Fremont, we find out from a man.
Yep.
She's given very little chance to speak on her own behalf, and none of it really shines any light on her character. We needed Eve to do more than testify about how many shots were fired. We needed to hear from her about, okay, what was going on in her life that if she did initiate this relationship, why? But, again, like you pointed out, I'm glad you seized on this very same line. She's not the one on trial, and yet we are attacking her credibility. Now, I know that is kind of part of a courtroom drama. You get a character on the stand, you either they're shockingly right about something or you start tearing them apart. But she is not accused of anything in this trial. She is not the one who stands accused. At the end of this, if this were in the 21st century, Frank Piper could be, filing a civil suit against her. at the end of these proceedings for something, because we have found out that she kind of set things in motion and engineered the situation, or tried to. Yeah, it didn't turn out the way she planned for it to. In 1960, all we're really getting is Frank Piper's just happy he's not headed for the chair. But it really struck me that we're on week 2 in a row of the major female character in the story really not getting to speak for herself.
Yeah.
And that starts looking like a trend. It's really surprising, given how well Gene has written for women in some, though admittedly not all, of his past scripts.
Right.
And so, the trend kind of sticks out to me and bothers me a bit. Now, on the good side, I will say that DeForest Kelley is the glue that holds this whole thing together. And this was, the first time he got to work closely with Gene, because that's something that being a producer makes possible, is that you get to have long conversations with your lead actor about who the character is. It may seem like a no-brainer to have the writer of a script on set during filming to clarify these things, but believe it or not, that is still something that's being fought over as recently as the 2023 writer's strike. Never mind the one that was underway in 1960. So, obviously, we see here a long-working relationship forming, and that's delightful. And I think that Gene's idea that DeForest Kelley had leading man potential, I think that was right on the money.
Absolutely. He was great in this. I don't know that I've ever seen DeForest in anything except Star Trek, so it was really fun for me to get to watch him in this role.
I would recommend 333 Montgomery over Night of the Lepus, I'll put it that way.
Night of the Lepus is on my my watch list just because it sounds like fun. But,
It's
it's killer bunnies.
It's a movie that someone chose to expose film for.
It was a choice.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah, it was a choice. There's some other elements of this that kind of got me a little bit. So Eve never reported Piper's previous harassment to the police before, and yet the police know that this has been an ongoing thing. I mean, it's possible that just came out of Eve's deposition after the shooting?
Sure. Yeah. She's like, well, she may have been saying, hey, this guy has been harassing me before. And that's when it comes out, when she's being interviewed about what happened. Like, do you know this guy who tried to get into your house and killed your husband?
Yeah. And that's a minefield to wander into, because it gets into things like victim shaming and victim blaming.
Right.
And
right. Why didn't you report?
Yeah, exactly.
Because I didn't want to go through this.
Yeah. Yeah. Bingo. Yeah. This almost seems like the first courtroom drama Gene has attempted to write. Although really, I would argue that distinction would go to The Posse on Have Gun Will Travel, which was a much tighter story, honestly. And the third act is much shorter than the first or second acts. It's really almost a tag out. It gives us just enough time to hear the closing arguments. And this is not something that's just a 333 Montgomery thing. This is something that happens to all kinds of courtroom dramas, big screen and small. The closing argument is a devastating slam dunk that no one could possibly argue with. This show is not the only courtroom show guilty of this. So I'm going to chalk that up to being a feature of the genre and not a bug. But unfortunately, we come back to Eve not being able to speak for herself. This is also a feature and not a bug. And let me present Exhibit B. This is from a script draft in the archive that is not the same as the revised final draft. This is also supposedly the final draft, but pre-revised. So this was dated January 28, 1960. And there is even more opening narration for Jake Britten. Jake is just basically talking over the whole crime as it plays out. Militat omnis amans, said Ovid. Love is warfare, and he might have added, even more dangerous. The unknown quantity is woman, a curious creature full of contradicting moods and strange attractions, and with as little logic in her love as in her hate. In fact, one can become the other with a speed and force which startle us duller male creatures. Yet we find her strangely necessary. First she gives us life, then she makes it worth living. And then, as the shots are fired in the house, Jake continues, some of us even believe she's worth dying for, the kind of thing which brings people to my law offices. Now, this is all very flowery, bordering on poetic, and very distinctly Gene. That definitely very Gene writing there. I'm not sure that it makes up for the fact that the woman whose truthfulness or lack thereof is at the heart of the story doesn't get to talk for herself. Because, again, everything we are finding out about her in that draft from the opening frames of the story, we are finding out secondhand from a man.
Yeah.
Is this me expecting too much from a writer who is generally regarded as being among the most progressive writers of his generation? Or am I not taking into account that that is a generation that seemed to be okay with women not being able to have their own bank accounts, etc., etc.?
Those are all fair points, my friend. I will say, you mentioned a bit of this in trivia, talking about, how Jake is described in the series Bible. We buy that, don't we? This is an ordered world. Queens never consort with beggars. This is a logical world. Men of wealth never steal from those less fortunate. This is a reasonable world. Nations do not go out and wage war under the banner of a prince of peace. Or do they? Or is this a most unreasonable world? Isn't it a fact we live in a strange, disordered society which prohibits the taking of a human life on one hand and then compounds that evil by taking the killer's life in an even more deliberate, colder, and crueler manner? I'm like, my goodness, what's up, Paladin? Didn't know you were in this episode. That to me, that was very, very much something that we could have heard in a more Western fashion from Paladin. I really liked that. That was some of the best writing in this episode.
Yeah, I'm always gonna stand up for Gene wanting to shout about the cruelty of the death penalty.
Yeah.
I liked that whole thing because also in there, this whole thing about, queens do not consort with commoners. I think it was commoners in the finished film.
Yeah.
We're also in maybe a very genteel white guy kind of way. Mm-hmm. We're kind of taking a sledgehammer to the social order of, oh, you don't hang out with those people. And whoever you want to put in the those people category, it fits. And so it feels like Gene is taking some well-earned shots at that, as well as the death penalty. This is very promising. I wish there were more episodes of it. I wish this had been the first series that had gotten made past the pilot. Yeah. Because between Gene and DeForest, there's a lot of promise here, even if the opening volley was a little less than polished.
I mean, I think there's definitely some good here. There's some things I have questions about regarding is that legal? Is that allowed? Going to a crime scene when it's, specifically locked off. That I don't feel like any lawyer today could do that or would even attempt it.
Now, I did like, one thing I did like, and I'm kind of jumping to my wrap up here,
mm-hmm.
that for all of the questionable way that Eve Fremont is written, I love Jake Britton's girl Friday. Because mm-hmm. she's way ahead of him. She knows what he needs to know before he knows he needs to know it. And I don't know if that really tips the scales in the other direction in the name of writing women well, but it was sure a nice change from what Eve got.
Yeah. And it felt so like contradictory to, the woman whose name is in the title card gets one scene, and the woman who's in the end credits has the better dialogue and potentially more of it.
Yeah, and boy, I hope they were teeing her up to stay in any potential series, because I just liked that relationship, because right before that, he gives her this whole condescending thing. Oh, well, a good legal secretary, blah, blah, blah. And then she's like, hey, here's this piece of information that I knew you need, and you didn't even know you needed it yet. And, on that piece of information, the entire case turns. She won that case for him, basically.
Oh, she absolutely did. No doubt about it.
Right, Ashley, I think we have examined and cross-examined 333 Montgomery extensively. And what is your verdict on this?
I think my verdict is this is a show I wish we had gotten more of. Kind of like with Hotel de Paris. I want something else to compare it to, just to see how this one episode stacks up. Because I like the structure. I really like DeForest Kelley as Jake.
Yeah.
I don't like how our main leading lady in this episode is handled. And again, I'm trying not to look at it through the lens of modern sensibilities, but even when there weren't quote-unquote modern sensibilities, assault still happens. Sexual harassment still happens. And just because I have quote-unquote modern sensibilities now doesn't mean that, while yes, Eve did wrong in this story, she wasn't the victim here. And I don't think you could have a story like this now, because too many women and other folks who are victims are often ignored or not taken seriously. Or even if they are taken seriously and they are granted victory in court, and whoever has assaulted or harassed them is actually punished for their wrongdoing, they still have the court of public opinion to deal with. And that may or may not be in their favor.
And, as is so often the case, people who complain about modern sensibilities kind of have to remind them, no, this isn't something new. It's just that we're finally talking about something that's always been there. From a historical perspective, Gene was now a producer. Now, technically, he got to be that for Nightstick before this, but Nightstick is completely lost. So this is the first tangible thing we have of Gene Roddenberry, the producer. It's not bad. It kind of falls into a lot of tropes of the genre that it's trying to inhabit. And like you said, there are some problems here with how we are writing at least some of the women, especially when they are talked about but don't get to talk for themselves. We don't get to find out why Eve Fremont was doing what she was doing. And so, she's kind of getting to shoulder the whole burden of whatever this story's original sin was. Okay, so really nothing new in the area of writing for women for thousands of years there. Gene was hardly the only writer to do things that way. And yet we have this great little scene with Jake's secretary, Liz. And she is wise to stuff that Jake has missed. They're a great team. He clearly would not be as good at his job without her. There's a lot of charm to that scene, and it's a nice little oasis in what is otherwise a very heavy story. I do want to give Gene credit for handing a critical piece of dialogue to Liz. The bit about the officer guarding the Fremont house being Jake's pal. The whole story makes no sense if that scene gets cut, so that scene stays in forever, unlike some of the other stuff that we really liked. So to his credit, Gene gave at least one of the women in his script a vital piece of the story. It really is kind of an average script that gets a huge amount of help from the sheer charisma of its star. So, my verdict on 333 Montgomery, I think it's safe to say that Gene and DeForest Kelley were always a great combination.
Mission Log Gene-ology is produced by Roddenberry Entertainment. Special thanks to the Roddenberry Repertory Players. Our cast this week featured John Krikorian as Jake Britten and James Kerwin as Captain Quincy. If you would like to support us directly, you can do so at patreon.com/missionlog for early access to shows and the Mission Log Discord. If you have any material that might be of interest to us that isn't already in the Roddenberry archive, drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com. Our website is missionlogpodcast.com.
On the next Gene-ology, have more hot takes. We'll still travel. Special thanks to consulting producers Matt Esposito, Homer Frizzell, Rand Hurl, Tom Kozak, Julie Miller, Mike Richards, Mike Schabel, Paul Shadwell, and David Takechi.
We'll be back next week with more of your favorite programs. This concludes our broadcast day.
This is a Roddenberry podcast. For more great podcasts, visit podcast.roddenberry.com.